So like most people, I spent last weekend binge-watching the latest entry in Marvel's cinematic universe on Netflix. This one's called Luke Cage, featuring one of the more prominent black superheroes out there. He was actually introduced on the last show, Jessica Jones, as a recurring character, and he was pretty cool over there, so I was excited to see what they could do with him on his own show. Unfortunately, the answer is not much. Luke Cage is a show that's got a couple of moments of good, surrounded by an enormous amount of mediocrity, to the point that halfway through the series I was ready to just turn it off and forget about it. But I do hate to leave things unfinished, and obviously I wanted to do this review, so I struggled through to the very unsatisfying and ultimately rather anticlimactic ending. So where did it all go wrong? Well, firstly, it has the Superman problem. Luke Cage is basically invulnerable and super strong, which means you gotta throw some pretty big stuff at him before it's gonna start to get interesting. Sure, it's cool to watch him wreck some low-level red shirts the first time, but that has rapidly diminishing returns. Eventually, it just gets downright boring unless the villains can bring something else to the table. This is something that Jessica Jones handled brilliantly. Her super strength was absolutely worthless against Kilgrave, thanks to his ability to mind control anyone who could get close enough to physically hurt him. And worse for her, it actually became a liability because if he mind controlled her, she became an incredibly powerful weapon for him to use on anyone and everything, including her friends, which made for an extremely tense conflict. Since Cage's villains are all run-of-the-mill humans, they have no ability to match him on a powered basis. That means they gotta find some other weaknesses to exploit, like, say, going after his friends and family. Problem is, Luke Cage explicitly avoids making connections to anyone to the point that he basically only has one friend in all of Harlem, and that guy also happens to be the one guy everybody in Harlem, including our villains, respects too much to hurt. So essentially, Luke Cage has no weaknesses at all in this story. The only way you can make up for that is to have villains who are crafty or inventive or just plain compelling to watch, and these villains are absolutely not that. Cottonmouth, who is the primary antagonist for most of the series, is about as dumb and ineffective a villain as you can possibly imagine. His solution to Luke Cage is to continue to send guys with guns after him. When little guns don't work, he tries to get bigger guns. Since Luke Cage is quite literally bulletproof, this is not exactly an effective strategy. Worse, Cottonmouth is one of those villains who simply cannot take anyone's advice. There's even a scene where his cousin says essentially, he's gotta breathe, right? Maybe try drowning him? Naturally, you'd think that would lead to the guy giving it a shot, but nope. He dismisses that idea and goes back to trying to find some magic bullets. This scene showcases another of Luke Cage's problems, by the way. Things that are very obviously set up go nowhere. The tone and tenor of the discussion being had about the potential ways to kill Cage could not hammer the foreshadowing button any harder than it did, and yet it goes absolutely nowhere and is never mentioned again. Nobody in this show tries to drown, suffocate, poison, or attack Cage with anything other than bullets and brute force. Halfway through the season, we randomly get a new and bigger villain called Diamondback, and his only real change of strategy is to use propaganda to get the cops to shoot at Luke Cage, in addition to the gangsters. He's name-dropped a few times at the beginning, but his appearance seems completely out of nowhere when it happens, and he's ultimately just a crazier version of Cottonmouth with bullets that can almost kinda hurt, but not apparently kill Luke Cage. And after the first time he uses them, he never succeeds in hitting Luke with them again for the rest of the series. So you end up with stupid villains trying to use brute force against an invulnerable hero, which basically makes it impossible for your hero to fail. Then on top of that, there are absolutely no stakes in this conflict whatsoever. Unlike Kingpin, who's trying to take over a city, or Kilgrave, who can just mind control and torment people, Cottonmouth is a run-of-the-mill gangster who, as far as we see, is pretty harmless to Harlem and has no ambitions of doing anything particularly evil. And Luke Cage doesn't care about Harlem anyway because he's only there to lie low. This is actually a rare instance of Marvel changing something about a character and having it backfire, because comic book Cage was from Harlem, so you could see him wanting to protect his home and his community. But Netflix Cage is from Georgia, and he spends half the show trying to decide if he should just bail before somebody discovers his real identity, so he has no roots. He has no connection to the community that is going to cause him to fight this guy, who himself isn't really much of a threat anyway. The only reason these two even come into conflict in the first place is because some kids rip off Cottonmouth, and the one guy Luke Cage likes happens to want to save one of these kids, and he guilts Luke Cage into trying to do so. The conflict is so minor, in fact, that it's very nearly settled with a simple discussion, because in the beginning, Cottonmouth is an amazingly reasonable guy for a villain. Then one of his underlings randomly decides to do something that is incredibly stupid, even for your typical dumbass henchman, and that results in Cage hating Cottonmouth just enough to be a pain in the ass, but not enough to walk into his club and snap his neck. Which he could do, because Cage doesn't have Superman's moral code exactly, and he's strong enough to just walk through anything Cottonmouth could send at him anyway. When everyone tries to say to Cottonmouth, hey, look man, you can't beat this guy, and he really doesn't seem to have an active interest in interfering with your future activities, so just let it go, and the whole thing will be over. Cottonmouth suddenly becomes all hardcore about the insult and starts offing people who want to just go back to business as usual. I mean, Luke Cage doesn't even have his stuff. The cops have his stuff. So it's just stupid for him to continue a conflict that he obviously cannot win. Now, if we condensed all of that into a 2-hour blaxploitation flick, it might still be fun enough to get by on the various actors' charisma, but they dragged this out for 13 episodes! There's more padding in this thing than a bumper room in an insane asylum. It's constantly sidetracked by endless subplots that I guess are supposed to flesh out the characters, but ultimately have nothing to do with the show at large. The biggest one is with the cousin, who is a politician that is kind of trying, but not really, to avoid falling into the criminal life like the rest of her family. You got this guy Glasses, who's supposedly Diamondback's right-hand man, but he really loves the cousin, I guess, and wants to be her number 2 instead for some reason. You've got hero detective Misty Knight, who has a complete mental breakdown midway through the series, and her partner, the corrupt cop, who is finally discovered being corrupt. And that's to say nothing of the origin stories for Luke, Cottonmouth, his cousin, and to a lesser extent, because it's poorly explained, Diamondback. Really, the only thing this show does right is the politics, which is mostly even-handed. It even rebuts the Black Lives Matter-ish take on things a couple of times, with Luke Cage saying he doesn't like black people calling him the N-word, and he values hard work. And the music is sometimes cool too, I guess, since it dips into jazz here and there. But in the end, you have a hero who doesn't want to be a hero, facing a villain who's not really all that bad, and then a villain who's just a nutjob, neither of whom can really hurt him, and their conflict is over nothing of importance. If it weren't likely to be referenced in the other parts of the MCU, I would just straight up say skip it. But anybody who really loves the MCU and wants to see every piece of it and make sure that they get all the references kind of has no choice but to watch this. But just be warned, keep your expectations low because it's not very good. Here's hoping Iron Fist will be better. But that's what I thought of Luke Cage. If you have a different opinion, feel free to comment below, or you can check out the Frags and Beer podcast that I was lucky enough to guest on, where we had a little argument about that, since those two guys happen to like Luke Cage a hell of a lot more than I did. So I will leave a link to that video in the description. And while you guys are all checking that out, I'm gonna go hang out with this scientist guy who says he can give me a special serum that'll make me super popular on YouTube so that I won't have to ask anyone to like my videos or subscribe to my channel.